Happy New Year, everybody. Hope everybody had a really nice break, and let's hope that 2021 will be a much better year than 2020 was. Hope you all had a great one. I can't wait to see you on Monday. Okay, so this is our last in our four-part video series. I hope everybody has watched. Remember, if you're watching this but you haven't watched the other videos yet, please do so right now, because by the time we start class on Monday, I want to make sure that everybody has seen all four videos at some point. So just make sure that by Monday's class you've watched all four videos, because we're starting a new topic on Monday. Okay, so this is going to be our last lesson about the Great Depression. We're going to focus today on the culture of the 1930s and how the Great Depression really impacted that. The Great Depression greatly influenced the culture of the decade in two ways. One, by actually exploring Depression era realities, but two, by offering escapism. A lot of times people just wanted to just forget about the depression and just how bad things were economically. So the movies, especially, and radio to a degree, offered kinds of entertainment that allowed people to kind of divert their attention away from their very difficult situations, or at least the difficult situation of American society at the time. So those are the two ways that the Depression influenced Depression era culture. We talked about in one of the other videos, about the silent generation, the fact that very few, or relatively few, children were actually being born in the 1930s. The population only increased by 7% in the 1930s compared to 20% in the 1920s, and much higher rates in the 40s, 50s, and 60s during the baby boom. A lot of people were just reluctant to have children, considering just how bad things were economically. Like, am I really going to be able to raise these children? Am I going to be able to afford them? So there are a lot less children born in the 1930s. So those were like people who came of age in the 1950s. So there was late 40s into the 1950s. So there were a lot less of them, young people, in the late 40s into the 1950s, than there were in the 60s and 70s, which is probably a big reason why we had a youth revolution in the 60s and 70s and we didn't in the 50s. Well, one factor. Now, in the 1930s, art, literature, philosophy, all of them kind of reflected the deep anxiety that a lot of people felt at the time, living through the Depression, but also a lot of anger. Anger at business, especially, but anger at American society in general. The fact that, how could this have happened, right? That in this country, we were promised the greatest standard of living in the world by our free market system, and it had failed spectacularly. So a lot of people were just very angry just about, the whole American system and the American way of life. Now, cultural standardization that, remember, we talked about in the 1920s continued into the 1930s, where everybody in different parts of America were kind of we're all engaged in the same type of leisure, or at least we're watching the same types of entertainment. Radio was still the most popular form of entertainment. Remember, radio is in people's homes. It's free. And programs that were particularly popular on the radio were radio soap operas. Now, when we think soap operas, we think of TV shows, right? We think of the soap operas, in the early afternoon that maybe your grandparents watch, but or maybe you got to watch actually because you were home all last year. But soap operas actually started on radio. They're called serials, not like the food, but Serial, because they continue from one episode to the other. In a serial fashion. They're called soap operas, interestingly, because soap companies, particularly Procter and Gamble, used to actually produce a lot of these early shows on radio and then later on television. That's why they're called soap operas. But these radio soaps were very popular because they offered a form of escapism, right? People could, not think about, the dreary nature of their own lives, if they're watching these radio programs. I can get through the day better when I hear they have sorrows too, said one listener of radio soap operas. Now, movies remained the most popular form of entertainment in the United States. I know what some of you guys are thinking, but wasn't there a depression? How did people afford to go to the movies? Well, a movie ticket only cost a nickel. And even when the economy was really bad, most people could afford a nickel. So movies were extremely popular. And in the 1930s, literally in the middle of the Depression, 65% of Americans went to at least one movie a week. So it was very popular. And also, it was an entire day's entertainment. When you went to the movies, you saw an A movie, which was the good movie. Then you saw a B movie, which was kind of like the, kind of the not as good movie. Usually it was like, a cheesy Western or a comedy or something. You saw a newsreel, you saw some cartoons, some shorts. So it could literally be 4 or 5 hours in the movie theater. So it was kind of an effective way of diversion and pretty cheap diversion too, costing only a nickel. Now the movies of the 1930s, I don't know if any of you are into old movies, but they usually fell in. I'm really into film, but they really fell into one of two genres. Some of them were very grim. Some of the 1930s movies, and it just reflected a lot of the anxiety that people felt about the existing order of things. Crime movies, gangster movies were very, very popular in the 1930s for a variety of reasons. It's a variation on typical American themes of good versus evil, fighting adversity, and all of that. But on some level, there was a bit of a glorification of of a lot of crime in the 1930s. Maybe on some subconscious or maybe conscious level, some people were like, oh wow, wouldn't that be great to rob a bank, and wouldn't that be great not to to be able to just kind of like operate however you want and have all the money you want. So there was I think an anti-hero quality to some of the movies, some of the gangster crime movies of the 1930s. Even though the movie code, the Hays Code, which actually set like a moral code for the movies, actually said the bad guy always has to be punished at the end of the movie. That's one of the reasons sometimes I love movies, but some of the reasons I'm hesitant sometimes to watch some of those old movies, because you almost know how it's going to end, because the bad guy is always going to get punished, because it was actually, they were contractually obligated, the movie studios, to make that happen. Um, so crime movies, gangster movies were very popular. There was this fascination with criminals in the 1930s, partly because there was so much crime in the 1930s. Bank robbery, kidnapping, were really big during this time. Bank robbers became almost folk heroes to a lot of Americans in the 1930s, like John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and Pretty Boy Floyd and all of those guys. So the movies kind of reflected the public's fascination with criminals. There was another genre of movies that were very escapist. That showed people living very, very glamorous lives. And, this made some people feel better who were living through very difficult times themselves. Personally, it made me feel worse. But for some people, people must have felt better because people kept going to those movies and they kept making them. But sometimes they had this elaborate choreography, almost these over the top dance numbers and productions. People living like Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, who were popular movie stars in the 30s, and dance films, ballroom dancing and tuxedos and tails and gowns and all that. So a lot of that kind of escapist cinema was very popular in the 1930s as a way to divert people's attention away from Depression era realities. One publicist for Hollywood actually said movies literally laughed the big bad wolf of the out of. Oh, I just blew that quote. Let me try this. Do it again. Movies literally laughed the big bad wolf of depression out of people's minds. So there was a lot of, again, a lot of escapism in a lot of these early movies. Now, movies were transformed in the 1930s by sound. There were no more silent films. Even though Modern Times, which Charlie Chaplin made in 1936, he actually brought back silent films for that one movie, because I think that's where he had kind of made his start and became famous through the silent films. He brought it back briefly for that one movie, but like all the movies had sound by the 1930s. And the animation, Walt Disney, was beginning to get really popular. Cartoons were becoming popular. That's also when you went to the movies. Sometimes you saw a couple of cartoons as well in your 4 or 5 hour long odyssey at the movie theater. But color also began getting used for the first time. Most movies were still black and white until good into the 1960s, but there were some movies, the big movies, that were in Technicolor, this over the top, very bright color. Probably the two most famous examples of that in the 1930s are probably the two most famous films of the decade: Gone with the Wind in 1939 and The Wizard of Oz in 1939. Right? It's hard to imagine those movies without film, but without color, but just think how special that must have been to actually go see Gone with the Wind or Wizard of Oz in 1939. When no other movies were in color. It was extremely expensive to have movies in color, and it wasn't technologically feasible. For most productions. But The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind really captured the public imagination, not only because of the color, but because of the plots, right? And if you guys haven't seen them, I'd really recommend you guys watch them. Gone with the Wind is a commitment though, because that's like 4 or 5 hours. And it is a glorification of the lost cause of the South and a glorification of the Southern way of life, the antebellum and way of life, and also it's a it's a movie that definitely reflects Confederate nostalgia for sure, even a little less so than the novel that the movie is based on. But they were both escapist films as well, right? The Wizard of Oz, going to some magical world, right? And the Gone with the Wind going back to a lost world. Were definitely of the past century, were definitely escapist films. Walt Disney pioneered animation. Mass production of cartoons happened for the first time in the 1930s. Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, eventually Looney Tunes, which really took off. Bugs Bunny, it really took off in the 1940s during the Second World War. I was a huge Looney Tunes fan. When I was little, not in the 1940s, but that was like in the 90s, but late 80s, 90s. When I was a little boy, and a lot of these Looney Tunes, cartoons that they used to show were very old. So you almost learned a lot of history from watching these cartoons, which often had Depression era and World War II era themes. Again, double features. That's what it was called when you went to the movies. The good movie and the B movie when you went to go. So it was a cheap source of entertainment for a lot of Americans with amazing new technological innovations that were coming out at the time. Most movies, almost all movies, were produced by a few big studios in the 1930s. So we had 20th Century Fox, we had Warner Brothers, we had MGM, we had Universal. These big studios, the ones that churned out a lot of, almost all of the movies of the time. In terms of music, some music reflected Depression era themes. A song I did not play for you, and I should have, because it's probably the most famous 1930s song, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" So I would suggest you go and listen to that. It tells a story of a man who fought World War One and worked hard his whole life and now is completely destitute. Reflecting the way a lot of people were living in the time. Jazz music was becoming more mainstream. Remember, jazz was so risque in the 1920s, but in the 1930s, less so, and it was also getting heavily watered down. As well. And rock music followed the same trajectory in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And jazz music in the 30s and the mainstreaming of jazz music ultimately led to swing music in the 1940s. Which was probably the most popular form of genre during the World War II era in the 40s. So, the changes in American life as a result of the Depression years. People who lived through the Great Depression never forgot it. Years, decades afterwards, it left an imprint on them forever. For millions of people, it was the definitive event of their lives. The fact that there was a time, it seemed, even if it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, but there was a time in their childhood, when they were younger, when years went by, when people literally didn't know whether they were going to eat, when people didn't know, whether they were going to have a job. There was no security at all. It was, it was a failure of major institutions like the banks and the government, at least during the Hoover years. So that left a long-lasting impact on a lot of people. People decades afterwards used to hoard money, never trust banks, put the money under the mattress. That was like a literal thing that people did who lived through the Depression. People often who lived through the Depression were very miserly. They didn't want to spend money because, they remembered a time when they didn't have any money. So it was a definitive event in the life of so many people. And then, which was our next topic, World War II happened. So a lot of the children who grew up during the Great Depression then had to go and fight World War II. So that's why they call them the greatest generation, because they went through so much during their early lives. And this unabiding faith that a lot of Americans had in the American dream and the American way of life was seriously undermined by the Great Depression, right? Because it seemed to make a lie out of all the things that people had been, brought up to believe about, well, you work hard, you'll become a success. That very simplistic idea really was, held by most, at least white Americans. And that faith was seriously eroded as a result of the Great Depression. The power of the federal government was strengthened beyond measure as a result of the Great Depression. When FDR became president, he enlarged the government to cover a lot of new things, to do a lot more things for people. The New Deal revolutionized the way people felt about their government, what their government should do. People, before the Great Depression, if either supported or accepted the fact that the government just didn't do much if they were suffering. But after the Great Depression, or at least once Roosevelt became president, but certainly after that, people expected that the federal government get involved to help them if things are going badly. That expectation was created as a result of the New Deal. The welfare state was created in the United States. We had Social Security, we had farm subsidies, we had unemployment insurance, we had greater regulation on business. So there was, there was an expectation that the government has to get involved, provide a basic safety net for people. There were still serious holes in it, right? And there still are to this day. Huge holes in the American safety net, especially when you compare us to other industrialized countries. But this was the first safety net ever created by a federal government at all in the United States as a result of the Great Depression. Economic recovery never quite happened in the 1930s. We never got over the Depression. But the thing is that it got a lot better as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's policies, but also there was this greater sense of optimism as we got deeper into the 1930s, because President Roosevelt made a lot of people believe that it's not the end of the world, that things will get better, that they have a government that's working for them. And that's a huge achievement, right? To actually instill Americans' faith in the future. So foreign threats began emerging by the late 1930s, which shifted the attention of a lot of Americans, particularly the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy and Spain. So that, people began shifting more to thinking about that as the decade ended, and away from a lot of the Depression era realities. But looming over the entire decade of the 1930s was the larger-than-life figure of Franklin Roosevelt. No American leader, I would argue, since George Washington, dominated American life in the way that Franklin Roosevelt did in the 1930s and into the 1940s, because he was elected 4 times. Now, the thing about Franklin Roosevelt, after Lincoln, along with Lincoln, is my favorite American president. I think he was a great man who did great things. But he wasn't a saint. He wasn't a genius, and he wasn't like a Superman. Superman also came out in the 1930s. He was just a supremely gifted politician with sheer determination to improve the living condition of the average American, the forgotten man. And that is what America needed during these desperate times of the 1930s. All right, guys. So that's the end of the video. So video series. So this was a serial, right? We hopefully you watched all 4 videos. If you haven't, please make sure you do so because it covers all the depression stuff. And when I see you on Monday, we're going to start talking about the road to the Second World War. All right. So I will see you all on Monday. Peace.